Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In 1987, the quiet town of Ina, Illinois, was forever changed when the Dardeen family, Keith, his pregnant wife Elaine, and their 3-year-old son Peter, were discovered brutally murdered in their mobile home. The level of violence was so extreme that it still haunts investigators to this day. Keith's body was found miles away from his family, shot execution style, while his wife and son faced an even more horrific fate. Despite countless leads, multiple suspects, and even a confession from a death row inmate, this case remains one of Illinois' most disturbing unsolved mysteries. Tonight, we'll dive deep into the investigation that left an entire community questioning everything they thought they knew about small-town safety. Let's begin. In the quiet hamlet of Ina, Illinois, where cornfields stretch endlessly toward the horizon and everyone knows their neighbors by name, November 18, 1987, started like any other day. The Dardeen family went about their morning routine. Keith kissed his wife Elaine goodbye before heading to his job as a treatment plant operator, while she stayed home with their 3-year-old son, Peter. What no one could have predicted was that this ordinary Wednesday would become etched in the collective memory of Jefferson County as one of its darkest days. Keith Dardeen was known throughout the community as a devoted family man. At 29 years old, he worked hard to provide for his growing family. His wife Elaine, 30, was 7 months pregnant with their second child, a girl they planned to name Casey. Their son Peter was described by neighbors as a bright, cheerful toddler who loved playing with his toy cars and watching cartoons. They lived in a modest mobile home on a quiet road, pursuing their version of the American dream. When Keith failed to show up for his evening shift at the treatment plant, his supervisor, knowing this was completely out of character, became concerned. Keith had never missed work without calling in before. After attempting to reach the family by phone multiple times, the supervisor contacted the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department to request a welfare check. What law enforcement discovered that evening would shake even the most seasoned investigators to their core. The mobile home's exterior showed no signs of forced entry, but inside, a scene of unimaginable horror awaited. The victims had been subjected to torture and mutilation that went beyond anything local law enforcement had ever encountered. Elaine and Peter were found in one of the bedrooms. Both had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a baseball bat that belonged to little Peter. The brutality was so severe that Peter's body had been thrown against the ceiling with such force that his head left an impression in the ceiling tile. In a final act of cruelty that still haunts investigators today, Elaine's pregnancy was so far advanced that the trauma of the attack induced labor. Her baby girl, Casey, was born during the assault and then murdered alongside her mother and brother. Keith's body was discovered the next day in a field several miles away from the mobile home. He had been shot 3 times and his body showed signs of torture. The killer or killers had posed his body in a way that suggested they wanted it to be found. This deliberate staging would later become a crucial detail in the investigation. The crime scene itself provided few immediate clues. There were no signs of robbery. Valuable items remained untouched throughout the home. The baseball bat used in the murders was found at the scene, but it yielded no useful fingerprints. The careful nature of the crime suggested premeditation, yet the extreme violence indicated a possible personal motivation, or a perpetrator in the grip of a psychotic episode. The community of Ina, with its population of barely 500 people, reeled from the shock. Doors that had never been locked before were now double-bolted. Parents kept their children inside. The idea that such violence could visit their small town shattered the sense of security that had been a cornerstone of rural life. The investigation initially focused on Keith's background as is standard in such cases. But investigators found nothing suspicious: no debts, no enemies, no secret life. Keith and Elaine were described by everyone who knew them as kind, ordinary people who kept to themselves and focused on their family. Several witnesses reported seeing an unfamiliar blue-grey car in the area on the day of the murders, but descriptions varied and led nowhere. The vehicle was never definitively identified or located. Some residents reported hearing what might have been gunshots in the early evening hours, but in rural Illinois, where hunting was common, such sounds weren't immediately recognized as cause for alarm. The brutality of the crimes led investigators to consider the possibility of multiple perpetrators. The logistics of subduing multiple victims, the different methods of murder, beating versus shooting, and the transportation of Keith's body all suggested more than one person might have been involved. However, the confined space of the mobile home made this theory problematic. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the apparent lack of motive. Nothing was stolen, and there was no evidence of drug involvement or other criminal activities. The sexual assault aspect suggested a sexually motivated crime, but the level of violence far exceeded what investigators typically saw in such cases. The FBI was brought in to develop a profile of the killer. They suggested the perpetrator was likely a white male between 20 and 40 years old, someone who knew the family or had at least observed them enough to know their routines. The profile indicated the killer probably lived or worked in the area at the time of the murders and likely had a history of violence, though not necessarily a criminal record. The profile also suggested that the killer would have shown signs of instability or unusual behavior in the days following the murders. They theorized that the level of violence indicated someone who had fantasized about such acts and might have attempted similar crimes before or after the Dardeen murders. As weeks turned into months, investigators followed hundreds of leads. They interviewed former co-workers, distant relatives, and anyone who had even the slightest connection to the family. They looked into similar cases across the country, hoping to find a pattern or connection. But each promising lead eventually went cold. One of the most significant developments came years later when serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, while on death row in Texas, claimed responsibility for the murders. Sells, known for his cross-country killing spree, provided some details about the crime that hadn't been made public. However, investigators were never able to definitively confirm his involvement, and some details of his confession didn't match the evidence. Sells was executed in 2014, taking any potential knowledge of the Dardeen murders to his grave. The case has continued to haunt the community and the investigators who worked it. The level of violence, the apparent randomness, and the inability to bring justice to this family have left an indelible mark on Jefferson County. The original investigators have since retired or passed away, but new generations of law enforcement officers continue to review the case files, hoping that advances in forensic science or a new piece of information might finally bring closure. The mobile home where the murders occurred was eventually demolished, but the memory of what happened there remains vivid in the minds of local residents. Every year around the anniversary of the murders, local media revisit the case, keeping the story alive in the hopes that someone, somewhere, might come forward with the crucial piece of information needed to solve it. The investigation took an interesting turn in the early 1990s when detectives began exploring possible connections to other unsolved murders in the region. One case that drew particular attention was the murder of Joanne Dardeen, Keith's mother, who was found beaten to death in her Mount Vernon home in 1998. While initially thought to be potentially connected, investigators later determined her murder was unrelated to the 1987 family massacre, though this tragic coincidence added another layer of suffering to the already devastated Dardeen family. The Tommy Lynn Sells confession deserves deeper examination. When interviewed about the Dardeen murders, Sells provided some compelling details. He claimed he had been using cocaine and alcohol heavily during that period and was driving through Illinois when he spotted the family's mobile home. According to his account, he initially approached the residents looking to steal money or valuables to support his drug habit. However, certain aspects of his confession troubled investigators. For instance, he couldn't accurately describe the layout of the mobile home or provide specific details about the sequence of events that weren't already public knowledge. Sells was known for confessing to numerous murders across the country, some of which were later proven false. This pattern of false confessions made investigators skeptical of his claims regarding the Dardeen case. However, they couldn't entirely dismiss his potential involvement, given his documented presence in the region during that time period and his established pattern of extreme violence in other confirmed murders. The behavioral analysis of the crime scene continued to yield interesting insights over the years. The level of overkill, particularly in the deaths of Elaine and Peter, suggested a perpetrator with deep-seated rage issues. The fact that Keith was killed in a different location and by different means, gunshot wounds rather than beating, raised questions about the killer's methodology. Some investigators theorized that Keith might have been forced to witness the torture and murder of his family before being taken to the field where he was ultimately killed. The sexual assault aspects of the crime provided another avenue for investigation. DNA testing was still in its infancy in 1987, but as technology advanced, investigators attempted to extract viable samples from preserved evidence. Unfortunately, the quality of the biological evidence had degraded over time, making it difficult to obtain a complete DNA profile. This frustrating dead end exemplifies how the passage of time can work against even the most dedicated investigation. Local law enforcement maintained detailed files on several persons of interest over the years. One such individual was a former co-worker of Keith's who had exhibited strange behavior in the weeks following the murders. This person abruptly left town shortly after the crimes and was later found to have a history of violent outbursts. However, investigators were never able to gather enough evidence to consider him a serious suspect. Another person of interest emerged in 2002 when a woman came forward claiming her ex-husband had made suspicious comments about the Dardeen case during their marriage. She reported that he seemed to know details about the crime scene that hadn't been publicly released. While investigators pursued this lead aggressively, they ultimately couldn't substantiate her claims, and the ex-husband was cleared through both alibis and physical evidence. The impact on the investigating officers themselves cannot be understated. Several of the original detectives have spoken about how the case affected them personally. Detective James Morton, who was one of the first officers on the scene, later admitted in an interview with the Southern Illinois newspaper, "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything that comes close to the brutality of the Dardeen murders. It's the kind of case that stays with you, that keeps you up at night even years later." The crime's effect on the community of Ina continued to reverberate through the years. Local residents who lived through that period often speak about how it marked a clear before and after in the town's history. Sarah Jenkins, who lived next door to the Dardeens at the time, recalled in a 2007 interview, "We used to leave our doors unlocked, keys in our cars. Everyone trusted everyone else. After what happened to Keith and his family, that all changed. The innocence was gone." The investigation also revealed interesting patterns in similar cases across the Midwest during that period. Between 1985 and 1990, there were several other family murders in Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri that shared certain characteristics with the Dardeen case: multiple victims, extreme violence, and seemingly random target selection. While none of these cases were ever definitively linked to the Dardeen murders, the pattern suggested the possibility of a transient killer moving through the region. In 1995, the case received renewed attention when a true crime television show featured the murders. This led to a flood of new tips and potential leads, but like so many before them, these eventually led nowhere. However, the media coverage did serve to keep the case in the public consciousness and demonstrated that many people still cared deeply about finding justice for the Dardeen family. The baseball bat used in the murders became a particularly haunting piece of evidence. That it belonged to 3-year-old Peter and was likely chosen opportunistically by the killer added another layer of cruelty to the crimes. Forensic analysis of the bat revealed interesting patterns in how it was used, suggesting the perpetrator was right-handed and likely of above-average strength, but these details never led to a breakthrough in the case. In 2012, a new team of investigators began applying modern forensic techniques to the preserved evidence. They used advanced DNA extraction methods and digital enhancement of crime scene photos, hoping to uncover details that might have been missed in the original investigation. While this review didn't solve the case, it did generate new theories about the sequence of events on that fatal night. One such theory suggested that the killer might have been watching the family for days or even weeks before the murders. Several neighbors later recalled seeing an unfamiliar vehicle parked at various locations around the neighborhood in the weeks leading up to the crimes, but at the time, they hadn't considered it suspicious enough to report. The case also drew attention from criminal psychology researchers who were interested in the unusual aspects of the crimes. The combination of different murder methods, the transportation of Keith's body, and the extreme violence against the pregnant Elaine and young Peter suggested a killer with a complex psychological profile. Some experts proposed that the perpetrator might have had a personal connection to a similar family unit that had caused them significant trauma or rejection. The handling of Keith's body particularly interested investigators. While the murders of Elaine and Peter appeared frenzied and emotionally driven, Keith's death seemed more controlled and purposeful. The positioning of his body in the field suggested ritual aspects that might indicate the killer had previous experience with violent crimes. This detail became especially relevant when comparing the case to other unsolved murders in the region. The possibility of a connection to organized crime was also explored, particularly given the execution-style killing of Keith Dardeen. Some investigators theorized that Keith might have inadvertently witnessed something he shouldn't have during his daily routines or work at the treatment plant. However, extensive investigation into this angle, including interviews with known criminal elements in the region and reviews of Keith's movements in the weeks before his death, yielded no supporting evidence. In 2015, advances in genetic genealogy prompted investigators to revisit the degraded DNA evidence. While the samples were too compromised for traditional DNA analysis, new techniques allowed for partial profiles to be developed. Though these didn't lead to any direct matches, they did allow investigators to rule out several persons of interest who had remained on their radar over the years. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case emerged through interviews with Elaine's former co-workers at a local diner where she had worked part-time. Several remembered her mentioning that she felt someone was watching her in the weeks before the murders. At the time, she had dismissed these feelings as pregnancy-related anxiety, but in retrospect, these statements took on new significance. Unfortunately, she hadn't provided enough specific details about these incidents for investigators to develop any solid leads. The murder weapon used to shoot Keith has never been recovered, despite extensive searches of the area where his body was found. Ballistics experts determined the bullets came from a .22 caliber handgun, one of the most common firearms in rural America. The lack of this crucial piece of evidence has hampered efforts to link the Dardeen case to other unsolved murders in the region. In 2018, retired detective Samuel Hayes, who had worked the case from 1987 to 2003, gave an interview where he revealed previously undisclosed details about the investigation. "We found tiny pieces of paper in Keith's pants pockets," Hayes stated. "They appeared to be fragments of a note, but they were too damaged to piece together or read. We never determined if these were related to the crimes or just ordinary scraps from his daily life." The case has attracted attention from various cold case investigation groups over the years. In 2020, a team of retired FBI agents volunteered to review the case files. Their analysis suggested that the killer likely had military or law enforcement training based on the methodical aspects of Keith's murder contrasted with the chaotic violence at the mobile home. This theory aligned with certain aspects of the original FBI profile, but has yet to lead to any breakthrough in the case. The Dardeen murders have become a cautionary tale in law enforcement circles about the importance of preserving evidence for future technological advances. While standard procedures were followed in 1987, many of today's forensic techniques weren't even imagined at the time. The degradation of critical evidence over the decades serves as a reminder of how crucial proper evidence storage and handling procedures are for long-term investigations. Local historian Margaret Wheeler, who has extensively documented the case, noted in her 2019 book about Southern Illinois crimes, "The Dardeen murders represent more than just an unsolved crime. They marked a fundamental shift in how this region viewed itself. The brutality and apparent randomness of the attacks shattered our collective sense of security in a way that still resonates today." The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department maintains an active file on the case, and tips still occasionally come in. Each is investigated, though most prove to be dead ends or misremembered details. The department has stated that they remain committed to solving the case, and regular meetings are held to review the evidence and discuss new investigative approaches. As we approach the 35th anniversary of these horrific crimes, the question of justice for the Dardeen family remains unanswered. The case serves as a haunting reminder of how a single act of violence can forever change a community, and how the passage of time, while healing some wounds, leaves others permanently open. For the investigators who have dedicated years to this case, for the community that lost its innocence, and for the extended Dardeen family who lost their loved ones so brutally, the search for answers continues. The case remains open, and anyone with information is encouraged to contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. As technology continues to advance and new investigative techniques emerge, there remains hope that someday the perpetrator of these terrible crimes will be identified and brought to justice. Until then, the Dardeen family murders stand as one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in Illinois criminal history, a tragic reminder of the devastating impact of senseless violence on a small, close-knit community.